Yeah, good morning, everybody. The Daybreak Show rolls on here with Jeff and Spencer. And on the phone line, as we have our Sheriff Sit Down Weekly, brought to you by our great folks at our Community Credit Union, Mason County Sheriff Casey Salisbury, and Dave Windom as well here. He is kind of directing all that is happening now as it relates to COVID-19. And the guys that meet often all throughout the week to get these new numbers and everything like that. A good chance on a Monday to look back on the week that was. And Dave, we started out by hearing that you had submitted to the governor's office your thoughts on Mason County's moving to a phase 2 variance. We heard quickly it was denied. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So initially they selected 10 counties that kind of pre-selected. These counties would be looked at certainly for a variance. And they're smaller counties with very few cases. And then they came out with a list of about 6 more counties, and Mason County was one of those. So we put in a variance, and the criteria was no new cases in 3 weeks, and we hadn't met that. But we put it forward anyway because we wanted to put out the idea that that's probably not the best way to measure something. So what we came out with was the CDC recommendation was no more than 10 new cases in 14 days. And when you break that out, it's like 0.71 cases per day. And we said, okay, if we use that as a standard, how does Mason County measure up? And when we looked at that, we were looking at over a 3-week time frame, about a 0.22 cases per day, so much lower than that. And we said, okay, so if we have 0.22 cases per day, do we have the resources that we need for testing and tracking and all those things to meet that demand? And whether it's the hospital, do we have the number of test kits? What all those things in the checklist? Do we meet those? Yes, we do. Just the one thing is that number. And they said, you know what? We're not ready to accept those numbers yet. Now, since then, they've taken those numbers, and we've had the discussion statewide, and we'll be having this discussion later as we go through this week. So let's take a look at those numbers, because that might be a good way to measure things for not only Mason County, but for the larger counties as well. Have some sort of a standard that we can measure against, that we can dedicate resources to.
So if you were to look at if there is one person who becomes positive for COVID-19, do you have an idea of the ripple of that? How many swabs, how much testing is needed for just one person? I mean, is that kind of what you guys were looking at, saying, okay, well, we have the ability to help in our hospital facilities blank many people based on these guidelines? Do you know what those numbers are? If one person becomes positive with COVID-19, that pretty much automatically puts a number of so many tests that are used, so many masks that are used per person?
Right. So there is that. With one person testing positive, so we would ask them about their contacts and then test those close contacts. Especially if they're symptomatic. The symptomatic piece is the important part. They got to be symptomatic before we do testing under the guidelines as they are now. So it's not just the number of swabs, because we're doing plenty of testing. We're doing 35 to 50 some tests per day for Mason County residents. So we've got that capability well met. We have excess capability. We're good to go in that department. PPE, the hospital has their PPE, and what we've looked at is, do we have enough reserve at the hospital for COVID response? And then do we have enough to do responding to regular disease work that they're doing, surgeries, whatever, and making sure we have enough PPE to handle all of that.
Do you think that the start of the easing of the restrictions, they kind of made it a little overly tight on the numbers that you can be accepted into the phase 2, just so they could get a sense of how the state is doing? Or did they set up did they determine these numbers based on federal guidelines?
Well, I talked to Secretary of Health about that, and he says that they really set the bar kind of necessarily high, because they wanted to see what the small counties did first and use that kind of as the test, something they could measure before the larger counties or counties that had more cases move forward.
I was watching some of the national news, and we're starting to see on the coasts, some of those numbers are starting to either flatten or go down, but then the Midwest starts to come up. And I'm just kind of thinking about how this correlates too with the King counties, the Pierce counties, the Thurston counties, those big population points versus the rural population points. To my mind, it's almost a similar conversation where you would talk about the coasts being the populous portions of the state and the Midwest of America being our more rural. Are you seeing some of those same trends where the major population bases are flattening or going down, but the rural areas are starting to rise? Not necessarily just Mason County, but the state overall?
Right. So we have seen that it's not necessarily a question between urban and rural or large or small.
Yeah.
Because we're seeing it small outbreaks in places like fruit packing plants, places where people are gathered together closely. That is really the kind of the deciding factor is how close people are together, whether it's urban or rural. Typically in rural areas, we have more social distancing. We have more room to spread out. We're not using as much buses and things like that where people crowd together. So in many ways, living in a rural area is an advantage when we have a disease outbreak like this.
When it comes to things that are starting to open up and we're going to start to see folks come in, we've seen some of the more major industries in the state start to come online. It looks like some of the casinos are starting to make their distancing plans and their reopening plans available. Is there any cause for concern within the group that meets about whether or not these industries are ready to open, or if Mason County is ready to open, or do you think we're trying to open to appease the residents?
So actually, I have been really impressed with the business community. They've come to us with their plans. And in many cases, before actually the guidance has come out from the governor's office on whatever particular industry, and their associations have been critical in putting together these business plans, whether it's restaurant or cars or whatever retail sales. Their associations have been deeply involved with putting together plans and working with the governor's office to have some sort of consistency across those things. So the things we've seen from the local business community are great. And I think if you go out and you walk and you look around the community, our businesses are doing a really good job with, spray guards and social distancing and masks. It's good to see. I think Mason County is ready to move forward. But we continue to watch those cases all the time because we want to make sure that people are safe and we can reopen.
This is a tough one too, because a lot of times in these types of situations where you're looking to reopen, you will invite perhaps those folks who make those decisions to come and maybe tour through the county. If you were to invite the office of the governor or the health department, that has to make it a whole lot more complicated for them to, if they came out to the county and they saw the sneeze guards here or that there, it might be easier for them to make these assumptions, but there's not a lot of travel going on. You really have to do a good job selling it kind of in your documents that you've been sending.
Well, absolutely. It's all about documentation. Anytime the government gets involved with things, it's documentation. They want to see it on paper. And frankly, people have been turning in some really well thought out plans. Our local EDC, Economic Development Council, has been working with businesses, and they have really sharp folks working on this.
Well, we're continuing to monitor it and report out on when you guys have information on the reopenings and just the daily briefs that you provide. It's been of course a welcome resource not only for us in the paper and just generally people getting that information. So we appreciate that, and we appreciate all the time you're able to spend with me here on the air. I think a lot of folks hear what you guys are talking about, and they're comforted, whether or not they necessarily agree or disagree with what's been handed down. At least they know that there are professional people that are working on this, and they know that the struggles Everybody's facing us all kind of the same way. Dave Windom and Casey Salisbury, Mason County Sheriff, during our Sheriff Sit Down. Good to talk with you guys. Be safe, and we'll check in and catch up next week and see where we're at.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, guys.